My husband stood up at the podium during his company's 10th anniversary celebration, raised his glass toward the crowded ballroom, and made a cruel offhand joke about my weight, comparing me unfavorably to his sleeker new junior associate while nearly 200 guests laughed uncomfortably around me. I sat there, my face burning, forcing a smile I didn't feel, while Palmer Whitlock basked in the scattered laughter his cruelty had generated, genuinely unaware that his careless, cutting joke had just triggered a chain of events that would cost him everything he'd spent a decade building. Stick with me, because by that following Sunday, Palmer had lost his company, his marriage, and the family fortune quietly propping up his entire business the whole time. My name is Odessa Kingston. I'm 33 years old, and for 8 years, I was married to Palmer Whitlock, founder and CEO of Whitlock Development, a commercial construction firm that had grown steadily throughout our marriage into a genuinely successful regional company, though what Palmer rarely acknowledged publicly, and what I'd never once used against him throughout our entire marriage, was that his company's early growth had been made possible almost entirely through a substantial, ongoing investment from my own father's private equity firm, Kingston Capital. That investment, structured carefully years earlier through a private partnership agreement between my father, Elliot Kingston, and Palmer, had remained the quiet financial backbone supporting Whitlock Development's expansion throughout our marriage, an arrangement my father had established specifically as a wedding gift of sorts, wanting to see his new son-in-law succeed, while also prudently structuring the investment with specific contractual provisions allowing Kingston Capital to withdraw its support under certain clearly defined circumstances. That evening, standing in that crowded ballroom, humiliated in front of colleagues, clients, and investors I'd spent years cultivating genuine friendships with, I understood with sudden, complete clarity exactly how thoroughly Palmer had come to take both my presence and my family's continued generosity entirely for granted throughout our marriage. Palmer and I met 9 years ago at an industry networking event my father had encouraged me to attend, drawn together initially by what felt like genuine, mutual ambition and shared values regarding building something meaningful together. Palmer's early career showed genuine promise, and my father, meeting him during our engagement, recognized considerable potential in both his vision and his work ethic, eventually offering the initial investment that would launch Whitlock Development just months after our wedding. Our early marriage proceeded with genuine warmth, Palmer expressing consistent gratitude toward both me and my father throughout those foundational years, understanding clearly and openly acknowledging how significantly Kingston Capital's investment had accelerated what would have otherwise been a considerably slower, more difficult path toward establishing his own independent company. That gratitude, though, gradually eroded over subsequent years as Whitlock Development's success grew increasingly visible throughout our regional business community, Palmer's public narrative shifting steadily toward emphasizing his own singular vision and entrepreneurial talent, a shift that mirrored, in some uncomfortable ways, patterns I'd witnessed among other successful men throughout my own professional circles, patterns where early support gradually becomes inconvenient to acknowledge once independent success feels sufficiently secured. I noticed, throughout those middle years of our marriage, increasingly frequent comments from Palmer regarding my appearance, comments that started subtly, framed as concern for my health or well-being, but that gradually revealed themselves as something considerably more cutting and personal, particularly during moments when he felt his own professional confidence required some external validation through minimizing or criticizing someone else, comments I'd absorbed quietly for years, genuinely uncertain how to address a pattern that felt simultaneously significant and difficult to articulate clearly to anyone outside our immediate marriage. Looking back now, I recognize considerably more clearly how gradually and consistently Palmer's public comments regarding my appearance had escalated throughout our marriage, moving from occasional private remarks during our early years toward increasingly public comments during business dinners and social gatherings as his own professional confidence grew alongside Whitlock Development's continued success. My closest friend, Adelaide Monroe, had mentioned her own growing concern regarding this pattern on several occasions throughout recent years, gently pointing out specific comments Palmer had made during shared social events that I genuinely, in the moment, dismissed as harmless teasing rather than the consistent, cumulative pattern of public diminishment. Adelaide had apparently observed considerably more clearly than I'd allowed myself to recognize. "He does this specific thing," Adelaide told me once, roughly a year before that anniversary party, "where he waits for moments when you're feeling confident, when you're genuinely enjoying yourself, and then he says something small, something he can frame as a joke, that takes the air out of the room for you specifically. I've watched it happen more times than I can count, Odessa, and I don't think it's accidental. I defended Palmer during that conversation, genuinely believing at the time that Adelaide was perhaps reading too much into ordinary marital teasing that every long-term couple presumably experienced to some degree. It wasn't until that specific anniversary party, watching Palmer deliver his cruel joke to a room of nearly 200 people, that I finally fully recognized exactly the pattern Adelaide had been trying gently to help me see throughout that previous year. Whitlock Development's 10th anniversary celebration represented the largest, most significant company event Palmer had ever hosted, bringing together major clients, longtime business partners, key employees, and several important investors, including my own father, Elliot, who had traveled specifically to attend and publicly celebrate the milestone his own early investment had helped make possible. Palmer's speech that evening began warmly enough, thanking key staff members and reflecting genuinely on the company's decade-long growth trajectory. It was during a lighter moment, apparently intended as comic relief within his broader remarks, that Palmer gestured toward me, seated at our table, and made his specific, cutting comment, comparing my appearance unfavorably to a junior associate seated nearby, framing the comparison as playful teasing about how some of us have kept up with the company's growth better than others. The room's laughter, scattered and visibly uncomfortable, told its own story immediately, several guests glancing toward me with expressions carrying genuine sympathy rather than shared amusement, clearly recognizing, even without knowing our marriage's private dynamics, exactly how inappropriate and cruel that specific comment had genuinely been within such a public, professional setting. My father's expression, I noticed immediately, shifted from polite attentiveness into something considerably harder, more assessing, as he watched Palmer's joke land across that crowded ballroom, watched me force a smile that clearly didn't reach my own eyes, watched the specific junior associate Palmer had referenced grow visibly uncomfortable herself at being invoked so carelessly within her employer's cruel joke at his own wife's expense. Elliot Kingston approached me quietly during the reception following Palmer's remarks, his expression carrying a controlled intensity one recognized immediately from years of watching him navigate difficult business negotiations throughout my childhood and young adulthood. "How long has this been happening?" he asked directly, his voice low enough that only I could hear the genuine concern beneath his carefully measured tone. I found myself, for the first time throughout our entire marriage, genuinely unable to minimize or explain away Palmer's behavior to my own father, the accumulated weight of years of similar, smaller comments suddenly feeling considerably more significant when examined honestly rather than dismissed individually as isolated incidents. "It's happened before," I admitted quietly. "Not usually this publicly, but yes, this isn't the first time." My father's jaw tightened visibly as he processed this admission, and I watched him glance across the room toward Palmer, who remained entirely oblivious throughout the reception's continuation, laughing warmly with clients and investors, apparently genuinely unaware of how thoroughly his careless cruelty had just been witnessed and processed by the one person in that entire room whose continued financial support represented the actual foundation beneath his company's impressive decade of growth. "I need you to think carefully tonight," my father told me, his voice carrying a quiet resolve I recognized from years of watching him make significant business decisions. "Not about Palmer specifically, but about what you actually want your life to look like going forward. Whatever you decide, I want you to know I'll support you completely, regardless of what that means for my own investment in his company." I spent that entire following Saturday processing genuine grief and clarity simultaneously, finally allowing myself to examine honestly the full pattern Adelaide had gently tried helping me recognize throughout the previous year, a pattern extending considerably beyond that single public humiliation into years of gradually accumulated diminishment I'd normalized specifically because each individual instance had felt, in isolation, too small to genuinely warrant serious confrontation. I called Adelaide that Saturday afternoon, finally ready to have the honest conversation I'd previously deflected throughout that earlier discussion nearly a year before. "I think I've been making excuses for a long time," I told her, sitting alone in our home office while Palmer remained occupied with post-party follow-up calls to key clients and investors. I kept telling myself it wasn't serious enough to address directly, that I was being oversensitive, but watching that room's reaction last night, watching my own father's face, I can't keep pretending anymore that this is simply harmless teasing. Adelaide listened carefully, offering gentle but honest perspective throughout our lengthy conversation, ultimately helping me recognize that genuine partnership, the kind I'd always believed our marriage represented, simply doesn't include a spouse who consistently, publicly diminishes you for apparent entertainment or ego validation, regardless of how convincingly he might frame such behavior as harmless humor. I called my father later that same evening, having reached a clarity throughout that difficult day that felt both genuinely painful and simultaneously considerably freeing. "I've decided," I told him simply. "I want a divorce, and I understand if that affects your investment decisions regarding Whitlock development, but I need you to know that's not why I'm making this choice. I'm making it because I finally recognize I deserve considerably better than what Palmer has consistently shown me throughout our marriage." My father, working directly with his own legal and financial team at Kingston Capital that following Monday morning, began formally reviewing the specific contractual provisions governing their ongoing investment partnership with Whitlock Development, provisions that had always included language allowing withdrawal of support under circumstances involving significant reputational risk or fundamental changes to the personal relationship underlying the original investment agreement. I learned through my father's careful explanation later that week that he'd never fully disclosed to Palmer throughout their entire partnership exactly how personally significant my own well-being remained to his continued willingness to support the investment, a detail Palmer had apparently never considered important enough to genuinely examine, having instead simply assumed, throughout those years of growing success, that Kingston Capital's support reflected purely favorable business terms, rather than any genuine, ongoing personal consideration regarding how Palmer actually treated his own daughter. My father formally notified Whitlock Development's board that Monday morning regarding Kingston Capital's intention to withdraw its ongoing investment support, citing specific contractual provisions related to reputational concerns, providing the standard notice period required under their original agreement but making unmistakably clear that this withdrawal reflected a permanent, non-negotiable decision rather than any temporary business disagreement subject to renegotiation. Palmer, according to accounts I later received from mutual business contacts, received this notification with genuine shock, apparently having never seriously considered that his personal treatment of me might eventually intersect so directly and consequentially with the business partnership he'd always treated as entirely separate from our private marital dynamics. Whitlock Development's sudden loss of Kingston Capital's substantial ongoing investment triggered immediate, cascading financial complications throughout the company's operations, several major projects currently in development requiring the specific capital infusion that had, until that Monday morning, remained reliably available through an arrangement Palmer had apparently taken entirely for granted throughout recent years of steady, comfortable growth. Palmer attempted, over the following days, to secure alternative investment partnerships quickly enough to avoid genuine operational disruption, but the sudden, unexpected nature of Kingston Capital's withdrawal, combined with growing awareness throughout the local business community regarding the circumstances surrounding it, made securing comparable replacement investment considerably more difficult than Palmer had initially, confidently anticipated. Several key employees, learning about both the company's sudden financial instability and gradually, the specific circumstances that had triggered Kingston Capital's withdrawal, began quietly exploring alternative employment opportunities throughout that same week. Understanding correctly that a company suddenly losing its primary investment partner faced genuine uncertainty regarding both immediate project completion and longer-term operational stability. By that Thursday, just 4 days after his cruel, careless joke at his own anniversary celebration, Palmer faced a company genuinely destabilized by the sudden withdrawal of support he'd never fully appreciated as personally, rather than purely commercially motivated, a destabilization that would prove, over that following weekend, considerably more difficult to reverse than his initial confident attempts at damage control had assumed. I filed for divorce formally that Friday, working with an attorney entirely separate from any connection to Kingston Capital's business dealings, ensuring our marriage's dissolution proceeded through entirely appropriate legal channels regardless of the broader business consequences already unfolding simultaneously throughout that same difficult week. Palmer reached out to me repeatedly throughout that weekend, his messages shifting gradually from initial confused anger toward something considerably more desperate as the full scope of his company's sudden financial instability became increasingly apparent. Several messages specifically requesting that I intervene with my father regarding Kingston Capital's withdrawal, apparently still not fully grasping that his own behavior, rather than any decision I'd personally orchestrated, represented the actual root cause of everything now unfolding around him. By that Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after his cruel, careless comment had echoed through a ballroom full of colleagues and investors, Palmer's situation had deteriorated considerably beyond simple financial uncertainty. Our divorce proceedings were formally underway. Kingston Capital's withdrawal had triggered a broader crisis of confidence throughout Whitlock Development's remaining investor relationships, and several key staff members had formally submitted resignation notices, collectively representing a genuine, comprehensive unraveling of everything Palmer had spent a full decade carefully building. I didn't personally orchestrate every specific consequence Palmer faced throughout that difficult week. My own actions limited entirely to filing for divorce and honestly answering my father's direct questions regarding the pattern of behavior I'd finally allowed myself to fully acknowledge. But I recognized, processing everything that had unfolded within that single devastating week, a clear, unmistakable connection between years of casual cruelty Palmer had apparently believed carried no genuine consequence, and the comprehensive collapse that cruelty had ultimately, swiftly triggered once directed publicly, carelessly, at exactly the wrong moment, in front of exactly the wrong audience. I moved into my own apartment within 2 weeks of that anniversary party, beginning genuine, deliberate rebuilding of an independent life entirely separate from the years of gradual diminishment I'd finally, fully allowed myself to recognize and address directly rather than continuing to explain away as harmless teasing between two people who supposedly loved each other. My father and I grew considerably closer throughout that following year, our relationship deepening through the shared experience of finally addressing directly a pattern he'd apparently noticed developing for some time but had, out of respect for my own autonomy within my marriage, never previously felt entitled to address without my own explicit acknowledgement first. I began, roughly 6 months after our divorce finalized, working directly alongside my father at Kingston Capital, discovering genuine professional satisfaction and confidence in work that had nothing whatsoever to do with Palmer or the years I'd spent gradually, unconsciously shrinking myself to accommodate his own fragile ego and casual cruelty. Standing in my own office at Kingston Capital nearly 2 years after that devastating anniversary party, I thought often about that specific moment, about Palmer's careless joke and the scattered, uncomfortable laughter it had generated throughout that crowded ballroom. That joke, delivered so casually, so confidently, had apparently cost him nothing throughout years of similar smaller comments, and everything the single moment he finally carelessly delivered it in front of exactly the people whose continued support his entire empire had always quietly, precariously depended upon. I hadn't set out that Sunday to destroy anything Palmer had built. I'd simply, finally, stopped protecting a pattern of cruelty that had never deserved my continued silence, and everything that followed had unfolded, swiftly and completely, entirely according to consequences Palmer himself had spent years quietly, carelessly constructing.